Chapter 2. "John, honey, I think Titus just pulled in," Linda Jacobson said to her husband, who sat at the modestly sized round kitchen table. John had been lost in contemplation for a few minutes, running one densely calloused finger along a pair of grooves in the table's surface. Grooves that had begun their existence as jagged tears, but which, with time, had softened and smoothed to become an essential part of the table. He looked up suddenly at his wife, offered her a grin, and nodded, rising from his seat. "I'll set the table then," John said, pausing to twist at the waist sharply to crack his back. The motion caused his necklace to shift, the small silver cross landing on the left jag of his collared work shirt. He let out a sigh of relief as he returned to center, striding over to the cabinet for the diningware. That felt great. "I still think you should see a chiropractor," Linda gently prodded, waggling the dense plastic spatula at him by the oven. "That, or quit crawling around under other people's sinks. You have two guys, both of them younger than you, and they work for you. Can't you slide some more of the load onto them?" "Marty, maybe," John replied, taking 3 plates over to the table and setting places as the door from the driveway into the front hall whooshed open to announce his son's arrival into the house. "But not Steve. Him and his wife just had their kid a couple months ago. He's a new father. I don't want to keep him away from his kid too much." Linda came up beside him at the table, putting a dense table pad down in the middle of the surface and leaning over to give him a quick peck on the cheek. "That's very sweet of you, dear, but I worry about your back," she said. "Hey, Mom. Hey, Dad," Titus rumbled, scrooching through the doorway from the front hall into the kitchen and dining room area. John turned toward his son, angling his neck slightly to look up at the towering young Minotaur, who grinned down at him. Hands on his hips, John nodded back. "Caps?" "Already put them on, Dad," Titus said with a slight roll of the eyes. I know. You don't want the new tiles or the new floorboards getting scuffed," he added. He lifted one leg slightly so that John could look down at the dense hoof at the end, and the rubber-soled cap rolled up over it to protect the freshly laid kitchen tiling and floorboards in the hallway from said grooves. "What's for eats?" "One of your and my favorites," Linda answered with a smile. "Lasagna. Should be coming out here in about 5 minutes. Go put your things away." Titus headed back out into the front hallway, grabbed his duffel, and headed past the kitchen and living room on his right, up to the long, worn oak stairs to the narrow house's second floor, and made his way around the landing to the upstairs hallway. There were 3 rooms up there, his own bedroom, a bathroom, and what his parents had always referred to simply as the spare, but which had over time become a kind of hobby room, used by each member of the Jacobson family in turn. It hosted a small table with a sewing machine, which Linda used on occasion for crafting projects and decorations that she would bring into her classroom, a tall nightstand with an old CRT television hooked up to an SNES and Sega Genesis for Titus to relax with some old-school games on. And John also had a small round table set up within, arranged with a Warhammer miniatures battle engagement set up on it. Passing the spare room with a brief pause, Titus spotted the tiny jars of paint that his father used to carefully color the miniature soldiers and monstrosities produced by Games Workshop. It had been a while since his dad had picked up any of the figurines, but it appeared that he was preparing to finally come back around to the practice. The lumbering young Minotaur turned and headed onward to his bedroom, flipping on the light and tossing his duffel onto the specially reinforced bed that he rested upon at night. When he returned to the kitchen/dining room, his nostrils flaring happily at the scent of his mom's food, Titus paused in the entryway from the hall for just a moment, giving Mom and Dad a careful once-over. "Dad's back's bugging him again," he thought, stooping to step toward the table. "And Mom looks like something's on her mind." As he sat down with them, Titus cleared his throat, giving Mom a raised eyebrow. You don't usually make this on a weekday, Mom, he observed evenly, handing the serving spatula to his dad first. Did somebody die? When his mom didn't immediately respond, just giving him a look after a quick glance at Dad, Titus held his breath for a moment. Oh, shit, I was just kidding. Did somebody die? No, honey, but something did happen today, his mom replied with a gentle smile and a pat on the back of his massive hand. I messaged your father about it earlier, and he agreed that I should wait until you were actually here at home to tell you about it. Titus might have been troubled by such verbal obfuscation, but given that she presented as happy about whatever news she had to share, he assumed it would be positive. I've decided that I'm going to retire from the school, dear. Between your father's savings and investments and mine over the years, we can afford for me to take early retirement, and we'll get by just fine. Titus grinned, turning his hand over so that he could envelop hers in his softly. Hey, that's great, Mom. But aren't you going to miss the kids? You've always loved your job. While that's true, sweetie, there's been a lot of changes over the years, both to the curriculum and the expectations surrounding it, she said, slipping her hand free and pointing to the spatula being offered to Titus from his father. Titus passed it on to Mom without thinking, and she started serving herself. A lot of the kids these last few years, I feel a lot more disconnected from them than I used to. The 7th and 8th graders were already an ornery lot when I got started, but the last 9 or 10 years have been a little weird, if you ask me. There's an almost, godlessness to some of the things they say and do lately. Titus's eyes shifted slightly over to his father, gauging the older Jacobson's response. Linda Jacobson was known to family, friends, and peers as a very friendly, soft-spoken sort of woman, an excellent baker and cook, and talented at classical crafts like knitting and needlepoint. But she also had a reputation for being on the border of hectoring, sometimes, over her faith as a Protestant Christian. Her husband, also a man of belief, was a lot more relaxed in his adherence, opting to move through life in a more secular fashion outwardly, and this dichotomy between his parents had always left him feeling a bit of a tennis ball when the subject came up at home. Yet he always admired the way that they maneuvered through such conversations, ever with their affection for one another as a guiding lens through which to consider what each one had to say. I've read plenty of stories saying pretty much that same thing, John remarked. Titus took the spatula from his mom and carved himself out a sizable slab of the meal, setting it on the edge of the heat pad in the middle of the table before grabbing himself a dense chunk of the garlic bread his mom had also made. The Jacobsons tucked in, and small talk was made of the usual sort, with his father asking if Titus was scheduled to work either of his days off from school this week. I've got a 4-hour tomorrow and a full shift on Sunday, the young Minotaur replied. What times tomorrow? 7 to 11, Titus said. Is there a game? Arlington versus D.C., said John with a nod. Philly against New York on Sunday, but that one's kind of a given. That's not such a given these days, Dad. Birmingham dropped one to Michigan just last week, remember? Linda looked back and forth from husband to son, one eyebrow raised. UFL, Mom, Titus said in answer to her unasked question. You know, spring league football runs into summer. I always forget about that, she said. Well, at least you boys have always got some kind of football to watch. Yeah, though the UFL games aren't quite as high energy as the big dogs, John remarked. It's a nice middle ground between college and NFL ball, and it does help fill some of the gap between seasons, but we still end up with a couple of months there between when the UFL ends and the NFL preseason picks up. Their meal and small talk resumed until all three were well satisfied and cleanup was complete. Afterward, Titus headed up to his room, powering up his PS5 while messaging his friend Derek to see if he was up for a few rounds of Call of Duty. Derek would likely be up for a game or two, since the only commute he had after practice as a fellow defenseman was making his way to his dorm room, right there on the Buff State campus. "Give me 10, I'll hop on," came the reply to Titus's phone a minute later. With his evening of puttering around playing games locked in, the young Minotaur eased back in the heavy recliner in the middle of his room and smiled to himself. Life was good indeed, he thought. For the time being, he could put off wondering about what his last year of college would bring into his life. "That's just not fair," Cindy grumbled as Titus reached up and set the oversized jar of mayonnaise on the top shelf, reaching back down to the stock cart for the next one. "You know that, right?"
Life's like that, Sin," he replied, grunting as he turned and set the next jar up top, palming the container. He nudged aside the wheeled steps that the shorter young Hume woman had wheeled into the aisle so that she could start on their stocking task. "At least you didn't get stuck on one of the doors today." Walmart wasn't glamorous work, but it suited his purposes just perfect since his junior year of high school. Situated all of a 15-minute walk from home, Titus only bothered driving his truck there on weekends during the winter or when it was raining. He was sturdy and healthy, sure, as were most of his kind, but even Minotaurs caught the occasional seasonal cold and flu. Small favors, right? She waited until he had the last jar of mayo in hand, then grabbed the load cart and pulled it down the aisle to their next spot. She knelt down and held out one hand after rotating the bottles of ranch dressing before her. Titus handed her a small jug of the dressing, and they swiftly relayed the jugs until they were all in place. "You hear from Henry lately?" "A few days ago, he hit me up on Discord," Titus said. "He'd just got to Knoxville. Him and his buddies were pulling off to meet up with some guys from a chapter down there."
"You don't sound thrilled," Cindy remarked, halting their cart once more so she could start rotating jars of sweet relish while Titus opened the wrap around their resupply flat.
"Of course I'm not. He almost got pinched with those same guys last year for drugs," Titus groused, shaking his head. "I still live down the street from his mom, man. It gets awkward when I know more about her son's legal problems than she does."
"Not that it makes any sense," Titus observed. "He was never into doing that stuff when we were growing up. It was always working with his dad down at the garage or practicing with his band." "Yeah, well, at least his sister isn't still texting you every couple of weeks to ask if you'll ever open up about what happened between you two," Cindy said with a sigh.
"Well, yeah, Sin, that makes sense. You dated him, and last I checked, neither Henry or I are gay dudes," Titus said with a snort and grin.
The pair continued to refill the shelves in a couple more aisles, making friendly small talk as they completed their task. When Titus's oversized wristwatch chirped several times to remind him that it was noon, he bade Cindy a good rest of her shift and headed toward the break room, putting his sleeveless associate's vest in his locker and clocking out for the day. As he headed out to his truck, he double-checked his phone's Maps application to make sure he would make it to his destination on time.
Cutting it close.
"Better call," he muttered, putting in his Bluetooth earbud and calling Misha. The line rang twice before he heard the telltale connection.
"Hey, Mish, it's Titus," he said,
starting the truck and buckling in. "You just get off work?" she replied on her end, sounding somewhat flustered.
"Yeah, literally just pulling out of my spot. Should be there in about 15 minutes, he said, carefully pulling through the parking lot toward Route 20. "You getting set up?"
"Most of it, yeah, but my dad still can't lift the saw box out of the van. Well, with his back and everything. You remembered to put in trail and not street on your GPS, yeah?"
"I remembered, Mish. I pinned it for today on my calendar so I wouldn't fuck it up. You know, this wouldn't be a problem if I'd ever been there before."
"Yeah, well, the kid's parents probably wouldn't have taken too kindly to a strange Minotaur cruising by their place without a purpose, T. Hustle it up."
The line went dead, and Titus let out an annoyed snort. It had been one of the few things that Earth humans' legends and mythologies seemed to have gotten right about his race. Once a Minotaur had visited a location, they could infallibly find their way back to that place without fail. The only way to impair this innate capacity would be to somehow intoxicate or poison the Minotaur specimen in question. Titus risked a speeding ticket to make better time, and as he finally arrived at the location of Misha's performance, pulling up a good 12 yards back from her van, he caught sight of her father, Tarion, seated on the back bumper of her vehicle, the batwing doors open to either side of him. A native Chaldean-born elf, Tarion Turkin was a slender fellow indeed, standing about 6 feet in height, and sporting the kind of angled ears that had earned some of his peoples the slur knife ear among some Humes and greenskins. As Titus clambered out of his truck, Tarion smiled and waved at him, hopping down off of the van and smoothing out his tunic shirt and cloak. "Good timing, T," said Tarion with a nod. I'm sorry about not getting here sooner, Mr. Turkin." Titus felt a faint blush creep into his cheeks. Despite being a legal adult, he had been friends with Misha since they were children, two of the only non-Humes in their neighborhood. Despite their different heritages, they had taken a modicum of comfort in each other's differences from most of the families they lived near, though Titus often felt that he had the better situation. While he was more noticeably non-human, he had adopted parents who were both native-born Humes, where Misha's father was a Chaldean-born elf, and her mother a native Earth-born Hume. His parents were often quietly praised for opting to take on the challenge of raising an orphaned child from outside of their own species, where Misha's mother was often derided and ridiculed for being, quote, dazzled by outworlder charms. "Don't worry a bit about it, son. Help us get this thing out." Mr. Turkin turned to point at the saw box in the back of the panel van, and as Titus hoisted it out and lifted it up overhead out of the vehicle, Misha came around the van from the sidewalk fronting the house, causing the young Minotaur to take a moment to catch his breath. Despite her slight build and sylvan features, it had rarely escaped Titus that Misha was a strikingly pretty young woman. He well understood that she didn't precisely fit the standards of what most Humes viewed as classical beauty, nor those exactly of elves, but she came close enough on both fronts that it confused him that she had such a dearth of any sort of love life to speak of. Misha had opted to dress for these one-shot magic show gigs similar to a popular comic book character known as Zatanna, a DC Comics sorceress. The primary difference in garb was that, unlike the comic book character, Misha opted for leg-hugging trousers rather than a singlet paired with leggings or hosiery. Given that the clientele were the parents of a 7-year-old, she didn't think it appropriate for her attire to be any degree of revealing or titillating. "You could at least make it seem like a struggle to lift that thing, T," she quipped with a soft grin, arms folded in front of her. "Follow me out back. The mom's got all the rugrats clammed up inside for the time being." "Have you still got the stage screened?" her father inquired. "For now. Don't worry, Dad. That barely takes a second's thought to maintain." The older Turkin illusionist made a non-formative noise in his throat, and Titus followed behind Misha through the waist-high fence gate, onto the property and round the side of the house, into a backyard that appeared to have been modeled on every 1950s or 1960s television program featuring Midwest suburbia. The lone exception was a rounded wooden stage of sorts, elevated 6 or 7 inches off the grass, which Titus knew from helping meet with Misha's shows previously, was composed of a dozen smaller sections that snapped together to form a mobile performance stage. The magic that Misha had inherited from her father allowed her to craft some marvelous visual effects, yes, but there was just no substitute for having tangible, physical accoutrement in some cases. She had once explained to Titus that, while she could handily manipulate the visual presentation of her shows to make them appear as if they were being performed on such a stage, the additional concentration required to make even such a small adjustment over everything in an area would invariably take away from the potency of her other illusions. Having the mobile stage, the genuine props and costumes and hardware, it all made the actual weaving of magic much easier for her. A couple of years earlier, when dozens of, quote, mana springs started appearing in seemingly random places around the world, the second known instance historically, she informed Titus that she could literally feel more magical energy available for her to tap into anywhere she went. And she had taken advantage of this outflow immediately. As Titus set the saw box down, holding it aloft while Misha rolled a collapsible rolling cart underneath it, he thought about her original set of shows, which included the occasional live stream that she hosted on her Rumble channel. Those previous presentations had relied a lot more on genuine stagecraft compared to what she was working with now. More power to her, he thought, letting out a small snort of a laugh at his own choice of words. What's the joke? Oh, nothing, Mish. Just amusing myself. There anything else you need before I take up my usual post? Let me think. Misha planted her hands on her hips, standing next to a floating wall that she had set up to stash the first and second act's props and setups behind. Her father diligently arranged them back there, flitting to and fro. Her ears are almost the spitting image of his, he thought. The nose, too, though hers has been broken once or twice. Nothing immediately comes to mind. You're not gonna stick around and catch the performance? She gave him an impish smile, cocking her hips slightly to one side. Maybe see if there's a single mom who needs some extra attention. Not my scene, Mish, and you know it. He snickered a little, shaking his horned head. Besides, I got my switch out in the truck, and there's the shell station around the corner if I need to hit the head. Just come grab me when you're ready to wrap things up and get it all back in the van. Misha nodded, hooked a slim-fingered hand around the side of his neck to pull his head down for a quick peck on the cheek, and smiled at him. Should only be about an hour and a half, 2 hours max. We can hit Leo's afterwards to roll a few frames. He gave a thumbs up and headed back out to his truck, clambering in and taking his Nintendo Switch out from the concealed cubby under the cushioned armrest for his right arm. As his game loaded up, he heard an eruption of cheers and excited laughter, and he stole a glance at the air over the client's house, spotting the telltale streaks of light and bursts of color and noise that signaled the start of her performance. Break a leg, kid, he thought.